Chapter 15. Does China's rise really endanger the U.S., or just its sociopathic power elite? This was published August 14th, 2021. Government-sponsored fake news is brainwashing the American public into accepting a new U.S. NATO-sponsored Cold War with China. A massive blitz of Western propaganda is behind the escalating U.S. Cold War against China. President Biden and most of the U.S. Congress say China has become a serious threat that must be countered in every way and in every corner of the globe. The U.S.-led Cold War against China has escalated quickly and dramatically. President Biden is trying to harness the G7 and NATO to isolate China, and Congress is fast-tracking bills to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative and punish China for alleged human rights violations. The escalation is not new. Barack Obama launched the U.S. pivot to Asia. Now the seas around China bristle with U.S. aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines. Missiles and super bombers are aimed at China from Japan, Korea, Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Australia, with hundreds of thousands of troops. The U.S. recently forged the Quad Alliance with Japan, India, and Australia to further challenge China. But it's not enough. Biden wants all U.S. allies to join sides against China. There is a problem with this strategy. A New York Times report of June 16th said not all countries in NATO or the Group of Seven share Mr. Biden's zeal to isolate China. Germany, France, Italy, Greece, and several other European countries have major economic ties with China. French President Emmanuel Macron told Politico, NATO is an organization that concerns the North Atlantic. China has little to do with the North Atlantic. It was a casual comment, even as France also joined EU gestures to isolate China. The people of Europe do not want war. A survey by the European Council on Foreign Affairs in January 2021 found that most Europeans want to remain neutral. Only 22% would want to take the U.S. side in a war on China, and just 23% in a war on Russia. The Alliance of Democracies Foundation, ADF, in Europe conducted a poll of 50,000 people in 53 countries between February and April 2021 and found that more people around the world, 44%, see the United States as a threat to democracy in their countries than China, 38%, or Russia, 28%. That makes it hard for the U.S. to justify war in the name of democracy. In a larger poll of 124,000 people, which ADF conducted in 2020, countries where large majorities saw the United States as a danger to democracy included China, Germany, Austria, Denmark, Ireland, France, Greece, Belgium, Sweden, and Canada. ADF also studied the disparity between those who believe in democracy and those who think they live in one. This chart shows 73% of Chinese think their country is democratic, while just 49% of the U.S. believe their country is democratic. Another report from Harvard University's Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation finds that more than 90% of the Chinese people like their government and, quote, rate it as more capable and effective than ever before. Interestingly, more marginalized groups in poorer inland regions are actually comparatively more likely to report increases in satisfaction, end quote. It says Chinese people's attitudes appear to respond to real changes in their material well-being. Elevating 800 million people out of extreme poverty probably helped. This contrasts with people's attitudes in the United States, which are polarized politically, racially, and economically. Public trust in government is in crisis. This could be a reason for politicians to whip up a Cold War fever, and an urgent reason to take the danger seriously. There are very real human rights concerns at home, where police killings, homelessness, and mass incarceration are at pandemic proportions. In the U.S. Congress, there has been bipartisan support for the Innovation and Competition Act, which demonizes China's economic successes across the globe. charges fly that China favors its companies, both private and state-owned, in China and elsewhere through subsidies and special financing, while subjecting Western trade partners to forced technology transfer, theft of intellectual property, and more. The proposed response is for the U.S. government to do much the same. In Europe, Biden announced a Build Back Better Western version of global infrastructure development, but when and whether it will happen are unclear. Bernie Sanders wrote in Foreign Affairs in June 2021 that a fast-growing consensus is emerging in Washington that views the U.S.-China relationship as a zero-sum economic and military struggle. End quote. Sanders also stated that the rush to confront China has a very recent precedent, the global war on terror. In the wake of the 9/11 attacks, he says, the U.S. political establishment quickly concluded that anti-terrorism had to become the overriding focus of U.S. foreign policy. Almost 2 decades and $6 trillion later, it's become clear that national unity was exploited to launch a series of endless wars that proved enormously costly in human, economic, and strategic terms, and that gave rise to xenophobia and bigotry in U.S. politics, the brunt of it borne by American Muslim and Arab communities. It is no surprise that today, in a climate of relentless fear-mongering about China, the country is experiencing an increase in anti-Asian hate crimes. Media Bias and Human Rights, Part 1, Hong Kong. The media's demonization of China has been apparent in biased coverage of the 2019 Hong Kong protests, where the norm has been to present the protesters as heroic champions of human rights and democracy, and police and pro-Chinese government authorities as adherents of an authoritarian social order. Missing from this assessment, among other things, is the influence of the United States. Hong Kong native Julie Tang, now a retired judge of the San Francisco Superior Court, said recently that the 2019 riots began as a political protest against the extradition of a confessed murderer, but were supported by a shadow power, the National Endowment for Democracy, NED, a CIA offshoot, in an attempt to destabilize China through destruction and violence. In 2018, the NED gave $155,000 to the Anti-Beijing Solidarity Center in Hong Kong, which helped instigate the protests, and $200,000 to the National Democratic Institute and Hong Kong Human Rights Monitor. Rioters killed a 70-year-old man by hitting him with a brick and doused another with gasoline and burned him. They broke into the Parliament building, much like the January 6, 2021 fascist riot in Washington, D.C. Tang observes that Hong Kong ranks in the top 3 on the Fraser Human Freedom Index, while the United States is in 17th place. She quotes Hong Kong journalist Nuri Vitachi that, quote, Hong Kong's civil unrest was the most reported news story of 2019, yet every salient detail presented was incorrect. The city's freedoms had not been removed. Police killed no one. Agents from a global superpower were intimately involved, but it wasn't China. End quote. A key dimension of the media's bias was its parroting of the rioters' claims about police brutality, when the Hong Kong police had often displayed restraint in the face of violent protests and could be compared favorably to U.S. police. Unlike U.S. police, Hong Kong police do not carry sidearms. A good example of the media bias was a December 2019 CNN report on Hong Kong entitled A Generation Criminalized. Amidst a backdrop of photos pointing to the brutal suppression of the riots and tally of the number of protesters arrested and hospitalized and rounds of tear gas exploded by the police, authors James Griffiths and Jesse Young quoted from a protester, Ivan, who said that we seriously need to win this to say to whoever has the power that you cannot do this. You cannot do this to protesters or people fighting for their lives or their own freedom and values. End quote. Showing which side they were on, the authors lamented an entire generation criminalized in a fight for their future which could end up costing them just that. End quote. Left out was the fact that many of the protesters had engaged in criminal activity, along with the hidden hand of the NED. The Hong Kong riots ultimately failed. Retired Judge Tang says, quote, "Now there is peace in Hong Kong, but there is a proposed U.S. law to devote $300 million to anti-China propaganda," end quote. Belatedly, though, some honest reporting has come out. A CNN story on July 10, 2021, for example, was highlined, "Some Hong Kongers are glorifying a man who knifed a cop, showing the city's problems are far from over," end quote. It detailed how Hong Kong protesters established a memorial filled with flowers for a man who knifed a cop on July 1st and then committed suicide. The Student Union of prestigious Hong Kong University passed a motion that they, quote, "appreciated his sacrifice," end quote. This is the same university where many of the protesters, heralded as great champions of democracy on CNN and other media a year earlier, came from. Media Bias Part 2, The Myth of Uyghur Genocide. Besides Hong Kong, the media bias about China has been exemplified by the barrage of stories in mainstream outlets broadcasting the plight of the Uyghurs, many of which echoed U.S. government claims that China was committing genocide. The genocide claim is unfounded based on flimsy evidence that has been repeatedly debunked. The use of the term concentration camps to describe detention facilities has also been dubious. These facilities function as re-education centers where Uyghurs who were involved in Islamic terrorist activities are provided vocational skills, recreational activities, medical services, and a host of other benefits, and allowed to return home regularly. The U.S. media coverage failed to address the strategic importance of Xinjiang and U.S. support for separatist and Islamic terrorist movements there. Independent Canadian reporter Danielle Drumbill reports that the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, ETIM, which has claimed responsibility for attacks in Xinjiang and elsewhere in China, has been identified as a terrorist organization by the governments of China, Kazakhstan, Pakistan, Turkey, and the United States. The U.S. government removed ETIM from its list of terrorist organizations in October 2020 and has since provided funds to it through NED. Following explosive incidents of terrorist violence by ETIM, the Chinese government responded with repression. How much repression and for how long are matters of controversy. When Noam Chomsky was asked in an April 2021 New York Times podcast interview whether the situation of the Uyghurs was worse than the people of Gaza, he said no. The Uyghurs were not having their power plants destroyed, their sewage plants destroyed, and were not subjected to regular bombing, end quote. The exact number of Uyghurs placed in education camps is not known in the West. China has called the camps a large-scale job training program as part of its national anti-poverty crusade. On a personal visit to Xinjiang, Drumbill found that a very small minority of Uyghurs were repressed and a large portion benefited from job training. Responding to official U.S. charges of forced labor and genocide, Shun Shu, an associate professor of economics at John Jay College in New York, says if China has engaged in forced assimilation and eventual erasure of a vulnerable ethnic and religious minority group, there should be a decrease in the Uyghur population and increase in the Han. But Xinjiang's Uyghur population increased by 24.9% from 2010 to 2018, while the Han population in Xinjiang grew by only 2.2%. This was cited by Rees Ehrlich from Shun Shu's upcoming book, Sanctions as War. Right-wing religious extremist Adrian Zenz, who states that he is led by God on a mission against China, is the main source for U.S. government and media criticism of Xinjiang conditions. He is also funded by the Jamestown Foundation, an arch-conservative defense policy think tank in Washington, D.C., which was co-founded by William Casey, Reagan's CIA director. Other important sources are the World Uyghur Congress, the International Uyghur Human Rights and Democracy Foundation, and the Uyghur American Association, all of which receive substantial NED funding. Other sources include the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI, and the DC-based Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, both militaristic think tanks funded by U.S. and Western governments and weapons manufacturers. ASPI and CSIS successfully spearheaded a campaign against forced labor in Xinjiang, stimulating moves in Congress to ban U.S. imports from Xinjiang. Professor Kenneth Hammond of New Mexico State University recently explained the two main aspects of Chinese government policy toward ethnic and religious minorities. First, preservation and respect for their language and culture, and second, inclusion and opportunity through education, health care, and job training. Improved health care programs in Xinjiang have contributed to life expectancy increasing there from 31 years in 1949 to 72 currently. In 1949, there were 54 medical centers in Xinjiang. In 2017, there were more than 7,300 healthcare facilities and more than 1,600 hospitals. Literacy increased from 10% to more than 90% in the same period. Average income in Xinjiang has increased more than 10% since 2017. Tens of millions of Chinese people practice the Islamic faith. Of China's 55 officially recognized minority peoples, 10 are Sunni Muslim. There are more Islamic mosques in China than the United States. Uyghurs are the second largest group, after the Hui. Most Uyghurs practice a moderate form of Islam called Sufism, which promotes an ascetic lifestyle and shuns material wants. Sufism is incompatible with radical Islamic fundamentalism and Wahhabism, extremist beliefs which have been associated with terrorism in recent decades. The overwhelming majority of Uyghurs are not militant or extremist in outlook. Washington backs separatism and terror to undermine Belt and Road. Over the past generation, Washington and the CIA have provided ongoing support to Uyghur separatist organizations and terrorist groups such as the Turkestan Islamic Party, TIP, led by Abdul Haq al-Turkestani. The TIP, originally calling itself the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, ETIM, received direct CIA funding and sponsorship. Abdul Haq has served on Al-Qaeda's Executive Leadership Council. He calls for jihad, holy war, against China to attain the TIP's separatist goals. Prior to the 2008 Summer Olympic Games in Beijing, Abdul Haq ordered the TIP to unleash terrorist attacks against a number of cities in mainland China. Almost all of them were foiled. Following China's clampdown in Xinjiang starting in 2017, no terrorist acts have taken place in the province. Reports from first-hand delegations to Xinjiang from countries and organizations including Egypt, Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, Indonesia, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Thailand, Malaysia, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and even the World Bank have testified that neither genocide nor slavery accurately describes the reality of Xinjiang. At two separate convenings of the UN Human Rights Council in 2019 and 2020, letters condemning Chinese conduct in Xinjiang were outvoted 22 to 50 and 27 to 46, essentially the U.S. and its allies versus non-aligned countries. Why would the United States back separatism and terror in Xinjiang? Code Pink points to a concerted attempt by the U.S. in recent decades to balkanize China by delegitimizing or creating disruption in Hong Kong, Taiwan, the South China Sea, Tibet, and Xinjiang. Dismembering China has been a long-term goal of the U.S. government since 1949. Now Xinjiang is the linchpin of China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, and a rich resource, producing 85% of China's cotton and 25% of its oil. End quote. Xinjiang's largest cities, Urumqi and Kashgar, are main hubs on the BRI's Silk Road economic belt, with rail links from Kashgar through Pakistan to the Indian Ocean, and from Urumqi through Central Asia to Tehran, Istanbul, Moscow, and Western Europe. It is the biggest infrastructure project in human history, linking China across Eurasia and parts of Africa, 65 countries and more than 4 billion people. This may be why the U.S. considers the BRI a threat. If it could cut Xinjiang away from China, it might stop Belt and Road. Not too likely. Taiwan, the most dangerous place on Earth. Meanwhile, in the Taiwan Straits, there is a buildup of war danger. During the Trump years, the U.S. broke from recognizing the One China policy agreed to by Nixon in 1972, sending cabinet-level officials to meet with Taiwanese leaders and openly engaging in military cooperation. This continues under Biden, backed by U.S. nuclear-armed warships just like 1958, when a crisis threatened to escalate into nuclear holocaust. In May 2021, The Economist magazine called the Taiwan Straits the most dangerous place in Earth. The Biden administration inflamed the situation in August 2021 by approving sale of 40 155mm M109A6 medium self-propelled howitzer artillery systems to Taiwan in a deal valued at up to $750 million, a bonanza for the arms industry. The progressive forces in the U.S. need to stop the impending war with China before it starts, as Code Pink says. The price of war would be calamitous. We need to aim for peace, not war. China is not our enemy. Comparing U.S. and Chinese activity in Africa. There is a stark contrast between U.S. and Chinese political, economic, and security sector activity in Africa. The U.S. Africa Command maintains military presence in 50 African countries and has staged coups d'etat multiple times in the past decade. Libya in 2011, Mali in 2012, 2020, and 2021, Egypt in 2013, and Burkina Faso in 2015. U.S. trade and finance policies and practices in recent decades have amounted to a neocolonial regime, often referred to as a debt trap, that has left most African countries impoverished. Until the mid-1980s, America's closest African ally was apartheid South Africa. The United States and its European allies, principally Britain, France, Portugal, and Belgium, have fiercely resisted or sabotaged African decolonization efforts since the end of World War II. Kenya's President Uhuru Kenyatta said in 2018 that, quote, "We are very keen as a country, and I believe also as a continent, to partner strongly with China," end quote. Liberia's economic minister, Augustus Flomo, said China is a very, very important partner for our development strategy. Both leaders were speaking on the occasion of the 2018 Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which was attended by nearly all Africa's leaders. In May 2021 at the United Nations in New York, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi announced, together with African countries and the African Union, AU, the launch of an initiative on partnership for Africa's development. The emphasis is, quote, "to provide greater impetus to Africa's independent and sustainable development," end quote. It focuses on response to COVID-19 and post-COVID reconstruction, trade and investment, environmental protection, debt relief, agriculture, agro-industry, sustainable development, infrastructure, energy and transport, scientific and technical cooperation, digitalization, and industrialization, end quote. It calls for more vaccines for Africa and to help build African capacity to manufacture vaccines by waiving intellectual property protections for COVID-19 vaccines. As of April 5, 2021, China had donated vaccines to more than 80 countries and exported vaccines to more than 40 countries. As of March 2021, China has shared 48% of domestically manufactured vaccines with other countries through donations and exports. The statement said Africa is a stage for international cooperation, not an arena for big power competition. Quote, this initiative adheres to multilateralism and is open to all countries and international organizations in the world under the principle of African ownership, equality, and openness, end quote. Chinese foreign direct investment, FDI, in Africa surged from $75 million in 2003 to $2.7 billion in 2019. Chinese FDI flows to Africa have exceeded those from the U.S. since 2014, which have been declining since 2010. China-Africa bilateral trade has been steadily increasing for the past 16 years. The value of China-Africa trade in 2019 was $192 billion. The largest exporter to China from Africa in 2019 was Angola, followed by South Africa and the Republic of Congo. Nigeria bought the most Chinese goods in 2019, followed by South Africa and Egypt. While Chinese trade with Africa has surged in the past decade, U.S.-Africa trade has plummeted from a 2008 high of $113.5 billion in imports from Africa. While China's trade with Africa has surged in the past decade, U.S.-Africa trade has plummeted from a 2008 high $113.5 billion in imports from Africa to $23.7 billion in 2020. U.S. exports declined from $28.39 billion in 2008 to $22.15 billion in 2020. Total trade was about $46 billion, slightly more than one-fifth of China's trade with Africa. Chinese global foreign aid expenditures increased steadily from 2003 to 2015, growing from $631 million in 2003 to $3 billion in 2015. Between 2013 and 2018, 45% of China's foreign aid went to Africa. For the USA, total global economic and military assistance totaled about $50 billion in 2017, of which about $15 billion was military, roughly 30%, according to USAID's Foreign Aid Explorer website. Total U.S. economic assistance to the top 11 African recipient countries in 2017 was approximately $7.5 billion. Military assistance was about $1.5 billion, according to the same source. Based in Germany, AFRICOM's budget may not be included in U.S. military assistance figures for Africa. Africa's debt to U.S. banks and multilateral lending organizations, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, is another story. Quote, structural adjustment programs, or SAPs, have been the primary mode of the U.S.-Africa financial relationship. These programs forced African countries to pay off debts with increased debt in exchange for austerity and privatization measures. African nations have paid over 4 times the amount of their original debt to World Bank and IMF leaders since 1980. These debt payments bleed Africa of billions of dollars each year. By contrast, China's economic cooperation includes concessional loans at below commercial interest rates, grants, and interest-free loans. China has canceled debt to Africa's least developed countries. There's a graph showing China's foreign aid in 3 categories: concessional at 48.5%, grants at 43.3%, and interest-free loans at 4%. While China's commercial interest in Africa is clear, it needs mineral resources and oil, it provides significant value in return. Infrastructure projects like seaports, airports, railroads, highways, and digital connectivity grab headlines. Sharing China's own experience in poverty reduction, reversing desertification, and green energy are also important. So are industrial and agricultural assistance programs. General Stephen Townsend, commander of African, told Associated Press in late April that Chinese are outmaneuvering the U.S. in select countries in Africa. He said the Chinese are looking for a place where they can rearm and repair warships. This has been disputed by Deborah Brautigam, director of the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University of Advanced International Studies, who wrote in the Washington Post that many of the things our politicians believe about Chinese engagement are not actually true. She added that China's economic engagements in Africa are not of a predatory nature, but are, quote, very much in line with the economic interests of these African states, providing jobs to locals and improving public infrastructure, end quote. Brautigan's book, Will Africa Feed China?, debunks myths of Chinese land grabbing in Africa, according to Amadou Sy of the Brookings Institution's Africa Growth Initiative. Brautigam wrote that interest in China's role as an overseas agricultural investor in Africa has generated hundreds of newspaper articles and editorials, sensational statements, and robust myths, but surprisingly little investigative reporting. She found that out of over 6 million hectares of alleged Chinese land acquisitions, only 252,901 hectares had actually been acquired. In 2021, the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization found that Chinese enterprises working in Africa are making concerted efforts to engage in responsible agriculture. China's officially stated principles for development cooperation include respecting each other as equals. When cooperating with other countries for development, no country should interfere in their efforts to find a development path suited to their own national conditions, interfere in their internal affairs, impose its own will on them, attach political strings, or pursue political self-interest. Focusing on development and improving people's lives. It increases investment in poverty alleviation, disaster relief, education, health care, agriculture, employment, environmental protection, and climate change response, and actively participates in emergency humanitarian relief operations. Providing the means for independent development. China shares its experience and technologies and trains local talent and technicians to empower them to tap their own potential for diversified, independent, and sustainable development. Conducting effective cooperation in diverse forms, including complete projects, goods and materials, technical cooperation, cooperation in human resources development, South-South Cooperation Assistance Fund, SSCAF, medical teams, outbound volunteers, emergency humanitarian aid, and debt relief. China is committed to a multilateral approach. By the end of 2019, China had launched 82 projects under the South-South Cooperation Assistance Fund framework in cooperation with 14 international organizations, including the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, World Food Program, World Health Organization, United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, International Organization for Migration, IOM, and International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC. These projects cover agricultural development and food security, poverty reduction, health care for women and children, response to public health emergencies, education and training, post-disaster reconstruction, migrant and refugee protection, and aid for trade. The two largest program areas are agricultural development and food security, 37.89%, and poverty reduction, 37.71%. China has also set up funds in the World Trade Organization and the World Customs Organization for building trade capacity and helping developing economies, and particularly the least developed countries, to integrate into the multilateral trading system. China is not looking for war with the United States, and, quote, China has no intention of building a parallel international economic system competing with the one led by the U.S. China has been a key beneficiary of globalization in the past several decades and has a great stake in continuing that open and integrated international system, end quote. The Belt and Road Initiative, of which much of China's engagement with Africa is a part, could, quote, not only significantly increase living standards for 64% of the world population, but also become a new segment of the global supply chain, contributing to world economic growth, end quote. Such a development should be seen as positive, not as a threat. The real threat today is a war over Taiwan. During the Trump years, the U.S. broke from recognizing the One China policy agreed to by Nixon in 1972, sending cabinet-level officials to meet with Taiwanese leaders and openly engaging in military cooperation. This continues under Biden, backed up with U.S. nuclear-armed warships, just like 1958, when a crisis threatened to escalate into nuclear holocaust. We need to stop this war before it starts. What would happen to the world, retired Judge Julie Tang asks, if the United States and China were to go to war? The price of war would be calamitous. We need to aim for peace, not war. China is not our enemy.